Hello, I'm Jeremy, and today I'm going to be taking a look at a game by the name of Yinzi. This is put out by Spielworks. It's a 2 to 4 player game. The box says it plays in about 90 minutes. I certainly think that is within the realm of possibility, but I would think that your first play of this is going to take possibly 2.5, maybe 3 hours, based on my experience. It is a new game, like I said, put out by Spielworks. The designers credited on it are Rolla and Costa, so I assume that those are pseudonyms. The game box says ages 12 and up, but rest assured, this is a very heavy game. It is an efficiency engine, or an efficiency game of picking up and delivering goods that you're going to be growing in fields. It's set in ancient China, and players are going to be shipping those goods across the world, trying to fight off combatants, and just generally trying to be the best clan of merchants in ancient China. It's a heavy game. I'll take quite a few minutes to show you how the game plays, although that still won't be a comprehensive overview of everything that is going on in this game. It would take probably about twice as long to go into every niggling little rule in the game, but still, it should give you a sense of how the game plays. After I've done that, I will come back and let you know what I think about the game based on my plays thus far. So Yinzi is a game set during the Ming Dynasty in China, and players are going to be playing as merchant clans who are trying to maximize their influence over the region. So there is a very large game map, as I've set out here, which shows the Yangtze River divided into several provinces, which will have at them a number of ships that are in port. Players are going to be, essentially over the course of the game, doing a lot of different things, but growing crops, transporting those crops, or selling those crops to urban areas where essentially, I would imagine thematically, you're making a workforce which will then be able to utilize factories to produce consumer goods that could then be exported. So that's the broad theme of the game, although there's a lot of other things going on here, such as over in this section of the board, there's going to be a number of wars that happen over the course of the game. Essentially, each round there'll be a war, and players are going to have to contend with that. But it's, I think, at its core, a planning and economic game. So it has, I think if I did a rules explanation, I would spend about an hour or so going over all of the rules. Maybe, so you should probably definitely consider that for your first playthrough, and be aware that it's going to take quite a while to teach this game to people. But I'll just give a very high, broad-level overview. So the game is played over 4 rounds, and each round players are going to be doing 6 actions. And the unique mechanism of the game is driven by these cards. So each player at the start of the game is going to get 12 identical cards like this and shuffle them up. And then each round, a player will draw 3 of them and use those to perform their actions during a round. So you can see these cards essentially have on the top a number of slashes that will determine the strength of the card action, and then on the bottom a number of worker meeples. So together these are always going to equal 4. So we have a 3 and a 1 here, and a 2 and a 2 here, and then there are 1s and 3s also in the deck. So at the start of the round, players are going to first essentially bid for turn order up in this section of the board, and I'll try to zoom in on that a little bit. I understand that this is a very large board, but you can see up here this turn order track. Essentially, what happens here is in turn order, players are going to be able to claim one of these spaces here. So when they place their pawn into one of these spaces, 3 things will happen. First of all, they'll be staking a claim for turn order. Essentially, whoever's the furthest left will become the new first player. If you're further right, you'll go later in turn order. But on the further you go right, the better your bonus gets. So in each of these spaces, there are different bonuses that will let you avoid upkeep costs for your workers, or avoid paying taxes during the cleanup phase, or to give you instant upgrades to your factories or to your shipping power, which is actually tracked on this track up here at the top of the board. What it'll also do is allow you, so if you place here, you would get this benefit on this space, which in this case would be every time you sell a good for the next round, you're going to get an extra coin. What you'll also get is you'll get the opportunity, and this is optional, but you have the opportunity to buy this tile up here for the cost here. So you can see it starts at 1, and then it goes over all the way. The last one costs 3. So if you take the most powerful bonus, the planting tile that you would take would be the most expensive one. These will slide down over the course of the game. But so when you take this, what you'll do is you'll put this out onto the board with 2 cubes onto it. So essentially you'll have cubes that you could harvest and sell for profit, and then eventually transmit into consumer items. So those will go out onto the maps. So that'll be the first thing that you do, and then each player will pick one of those squares. That'll set the turn order, give each player a little bonus, and then the rest of the round is going to be driven, like I said, by these cards. So players will have 3 of these each round, and I'll zoom back out. And what they'll do is they will place them on this player board. So the player board looks like this, and this is really just an organizational player board. It doesn't have a lot of actual in-game information on it. It's really just a way for players to organize their moves. So you can see there are these 5 icons here, and these are tied to the 5 icons, or the 5 actions that you could do by playing a card. So if I played this card here, this 3, I would get to do this action here, which it would be upgrade your shipping lines up to 3 times. Whereas if I put it here, I would get to essentially put cubes out on those plantation tiles up to 3 times. So wherever you put that, you'll be able to do it up to 3 times. Once you do an action once during a round, so let's say I do this one here to upgrade my factories, I cannot do that again for the rest of the round. So my other 2 cards will have to go into different slots, essentially. The second thing that happens, actually what happens right when you place the card, is you put the number of workers in the spot below there. So I would put 1 worker in this spot here. There are essentially another 5 actions that you use your workers that you have on here to do actions out on these boards, worker placement spots. So you can see here, 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 here. Those are all worker placement spots where after you've essentially populated a section of your player board with some workers, you will then, in a subsequent action, again you have 6 actions, 3 of them with cards, 3 of them with worker placements, be able to take one of those groupings of workers, which could just be 1 in this case, but for example if you played this card out, you would get to take 2 of those workers and put them into a spot and do that action. So essentially these 5 actions are going to be required to do 3 of those, and then also 3 of the worker placement spots you'll have to do during the course of the round. Again, you cannot do the same action twice on either the board or on your player board. So let me just kind of give you a brief overview of what these actions do, and I think that might give you some sense of what you're trying to accomplish during the course of the game. So this one here, it just increases your shipping lines. So you can see at the top of the track there, you have a track that just indicates the power of your shipping lines. Whenever you're going to be transporting goods to your factories or to these marketplaces, which are in every province, to sell or to transfer them to the ships for export. Whenever you do that action, so let's say you're doing, transporting 3 cubes because you're using 3 workers to do that action, you would place those over here, and then you could only transport cubes across these little ship icons on the board, which essentially mark the borders and then also the sea border that would get them onto the ships. You can only do that for your turn up to however many ships you have at the top of that track. So you start with 1, but it could be increased all the way to 6. The second thing that you could do, the second action, is to essentially claim spots on the boards to plant seeds or harvest. To plant plants. So in each province you see these little grids, and on those grids, and maybe it would help if I just zoom in a little bit, you can see there are different icons. So here we have fruit, here we have rice, and so on. So for each action that you get there, and again the number of actions is just going to be determined by the top of the card. So if I played this, for example, I might get 2 actions. I could claim one of those squares. So I could put one of my cubes here. I could put, you can see these rice have 2 on them. I would actually get to put 2 of those out. And what you could also do, and this is only once per time that you take this action, is buy one of these tiles from that turn order section of the board. So up at the top there where I was explaining how you pick turn order, you could buy one of these and immediately put it onto any space that does not have a cube or a factory already on it, and you would get 2 cubes on it immediately. So the reason why you want to do that is because, like I said, you're going to be able to sell those cubes for money or eventually turn those into processed goods in your factories. So that's the second action. The third action is actually just selling those goods. So again, you'll be able to, the number of times you do that action, take these goods, move them onto these local or these urban markets in these various areas, and you'll get 2 coins for each ones that you bring over. Again, though, if it's in the same province, you don't have to worry about transporting it, but you can see here in this province, there's no place that wants bamboo. There is one up here, but to use this, to bring this one up here, I would need to essentially use one of my ships. You don't actually spend those ships, you just have a limit to how many goods you could transfer based on your strength of your ships. So bringing this cube to here would cost me one of my ships, or utilize one of my ships. There's some ways that you could get an extra payout on here, but I won't go into that. That's a little bit like minutia. The next action is to upgrade your factories. So the way the factories work in this game is interesting. I'll just grab one over here. So there's always going to be factories that you could build, and these are tied to the player colors, sort of. So this one you see here, to run this factory, which will produce these blankets, it requires red goods. So the border of this determines what sort of input goods it requires. But another player could build this. So the green player, in this case, would be able to build this out, and they would mark their ownership of this with a disc, and then they would place that out on the board. So they could put it anywhere. They could essentially put it anywhere that doesn't cover up a salt mine space on the board, or a place with a cube on it. But in order to run it, they will need to transport red goods that have been sold to market, so that are effectively on these urban market spaces, over to that space. So this player, if they wanted to run this market, or this factory, when they did a factory action, which I'll explain in a moment, they would need to bring this good over here to run it, to generate a good, and then once they generate the good, they would mark it with another wooden piece like that. So building your factories is important, and there's also, when you take that action, the option to upgrade your factories. They can be upgraded up to 3 levels by basically adding discs to that. That will do a few things. It'll increase the amount of productivity they give you, so you'll need fewer workers to actually produce a good. It'll make it more expensive for other players to use that factory, because other players can use your factories. You usually just get a bonus for that. And then the third thing is it will give you victory points at the end of the game, because your factories score, as you can see here, 5, 3, or 2 points for being level 3, 2, or 1. Also, it will increase your storage capacity. Each factory could only hold as many produced goods as its level is. So, and then the last action that you could take by playing your card and counting the slashes on the card is tied to this section of the board up here. And this is definitely too much to explain for the sake of this video. But over here, you will get to put, there are 4 areas up here. Depending on your power, you can put 1 disc in each area that you've played. So if I play a level 3, I can put 1 in 3 of these 4 areas. You essentially just mark a disc in here. Later, you could choose to pull that disc off to activate the instant benefit that's shown on it. So that could be just a resource, or food for your workers, or some instant money, or it could be a diplomat who ships out for bonus points when you ship goods to one of those ships. There's essentially a lot of different options in that board up there, but that is how you're going to activate that board. So those are the actions that you could do by playing your cards. But like I said, as you play your cards, you're going to be placing workers into these spaces here below on your player board, and then pulling those workers off, and then putting them into a single worker spot on the board to activate those over the course of the round. So you will always have to do your first work action to play a card, so because you won't have any workers on your board. So if I play this card here, I'll generate a worker here. Then my next action, I could either choose to pull this worker off and play it, or play another card to generate more workers. So your first action will always be play a card. Your last action will always be pull your last set of workers off of here and put them onto the board. And like I said, they'll go into these worker spaces. These are also relatively complex, but I'll just give you a brief overview. This space here, for each worker that you send there, and each money that you pay, you could basically take one of two cubes. There's two types of cubes. There are stone and there are wood. The stone is used to build new factories. The wood is used whenever you want to upgrade your ship. So essentially, each time you want to upgrade your ship, you have to spend a wood. So that's relatively simple. This area here along the bottom, let me make sure you can see that. It's essentially a number of discrete worker placement spaces that you could place into depending on the size of the grouping that you're sending over there. That will give you a bonus at the end of the round, money plus either a factory upgrade, a ship upgrade, or a personal goal tile that you could complete by sending goods to it, and that would give you a money and victory point bonus. The next area over here is essentially the war area, so let me just put that a little bit more centered. So you can see this area here. You're going to send a number of workers to the leftmost space here, so essentially like that. And then you'll have the opportunity to complete one of those tiles just like I just showed you. So like, for example, if you had these resources in fields that you owned, you could bring them over onto here, you would get this payout, and then at the end of the round, you would get this tile, which would be worth endgame points. Also significant, there'll be a number of these tiles set out equal to the number of players. If collectively players meet or match that number of symbols that are up here, so like here the players would have to collectively meet 2 of them, then the player who has contributed the most, ties broken by whoever's furthest left, gets to place onto this 4 here for 4 victory points at the end of the game. If there was a second player, they would get to place onto the, or a second place player, they would get to place onto the 2. These tiles could also invoke disasters. There are, some of them have on them essentially small little symbols that I'm not seeing right now, but essentially, here we go. Amazingly, none of those have them on there. Here we go. So you can see some of those will have on them disasters that could come out and adversely affect all players. There's really no way to mitigate those. This is definitely demoralizing when it happens, but this would affect your shipping route, make you go back on that track. This would make one of your factories lose a level, which could potentially cause you to lose goods, and this would make you lose cubes out in the fields. So it's a drought, a flood, a fire. So those would also take effect at the end of the round, regardless of whether or not the players defeated the military strength of those tiles. So there are 2 other spaces on the board. There's essentially, and let me just move my camera over here, this space on the far right is a shipping space. You could, for every worker that you send here, you could send goods to these ships. There's going to be a certain number of ships in the ports. Those are going to be equal to the number of players, and you could transport either goods directly from your fields, as in the case of this T, or from your factories, the completed goods, onto these tiles. Those are going to be transmitted up to these spaces at the top of the board at the end of the game, and they will give you victory points. So these spaces up here, once a ship fills up, a new ship will come in, and then the tiles will go up here. Every time you make a contribution to that, you also get a bag of silver, which is a little different kind of resource in the game. These are used sometimes at the end of the round to avoid taking penalties. You essentially have to pay taxes as part of the cleanup. And the last space, actually I think that was the last space. No, the last space is the production space, which is over here. And essentially that is how you will make your factories fire up and produce goods. And basically based on the level of that factory, you'll have to send a different number of workers there. You'll pull cubes that are desired by that factory. So this one desires green cubes. So you'll pull those cubes off to essentially run that factory and produce goods. So here, for example, since it was a level 3 factory, this player could send 1 worker here, pull off 2 cubes, and then immediately make 2 goods, which then they could later ship out to the ships there, or use to complete these tiles over here. So that is a very broad level overview. There's definitely some wrinkles to the action selection mechanic. One thing that is always an option whenever you're placing workers, let's say you had 3 workers to place in this section, but you only wanted to place 2, you could send one over here. You'll still have to feed him at the end of the round. I didn't really explain feeding yet, but the next round they'll move down here, and then he could be added to another group. So if you only had 1 on the next turn, and you want to go in this space here that requires 2, you could pull the guy out from this bottom cloud over here and add him. Similarly, if you were using one of these slash cards, so let's say you're using this card to do this action and you wanted to increase that, you could put one of your discs on this little space up here, effectively taxing your people, and then you would add 1 to this action. Essentially, you could do that to bolster any one of these cards by 1. The caveat with this is you have to feed any people who are left out on the board. The caveat with this is at the end of the round, you'll look at your total number of slashes on your cards that you've played, plus on the discs that you've put up here, and you'll have to turn in those little bags of silver depending on where you fall within this range. Again, that if ever you can't turn in silver, you'll take negative points, but you're required to buy silver if possible using, on this part of the board here, the last part of the board, I think, to explain, this exchange rate, which will effectively go up over the course of the game, or down over the course of the game. It starts at this 2 space where you could see you could buy those silver bags if you need them for purposes of paying those taxes for a cost of 5 each. Again, you'll also gain those as you make shipments out here, and sometimes for completing those war tiles. At the end of the round, you'll adjust that by rolling this die, and if the number is higher than the number that it was, it will move up 1 space. So over the course of the game, this exchange rate will tend to get worse. So you cannot just buy victory points. Each one of those bags is worth a victory point at the end of the game. You can't just buy those victory points. You can only take them when you need them. But at the end of the game, based on that exchange rate, your cash on hand will turn into victory points. So once you've done your 6 actions, again, that's going to be 3 worker placement actions as well as 3 card actions. There's going to be a cleanup phase where players essentially have to feed their workers. Every 3 pawns that you have out on the board, you have to give 1 rice or other food to, essentially by removing them from a field. You could also potentially buy them. There's a market that you could sell to for a free action. If there's things in there, you could buy those to feed your people. Again, if you can't feed your people, you will take negative points. There are little -2 tokens for every food that you're missing. And then you will also have to pay taxes, as I just explained here. If you cannot meet the requirements there, you'll also take negative points. And then there's some other cleanups. You'll resolve this war area, see if you made it or not, award the bonus points to the victor. And then you will essentially go back and repeat the same thing about 3 more times, starting with players picking turn order and a bonus again. So a couple things will happen over the course of the game that just add a little bit of flair. These ships are going to be, essentially grouped into 2 groups. There's the Eastern ships, and then the ships that are from Europe. The first time one of those ships from Europe comes out, it brings with it corn and potatoes as new goods that could be grown on the board. Those will get shuffled into the group. And shipping those goods to the European ships does have a better victory point yield. The game, at the end of it, you essentially will then just score after you've played your 4th round, and you'll get points, and I'll just explain this pretty broadly. You'll get points for your boat track, your progress on the boat track. You get 2 points for every movement on there. You'll get points for your factories. Again, if they're level 3, they're worth 5 points, and so on. You'll get points for the commodities that you've shipped out that have made it to their destination countries. There's essentially points for getting there first with your commodities. You'll get points for these tiles that you've completed, as well as for every time that you've come in first or second for having the most soldiers committed over here. You will get points. This area here that has the bonus actions I briefly described, if you have leftover discs on there, there's an area majority bonus for having the most leftover discs there. And then every one of those silvers that you have on hand, including the ones that you're able to buy based on the exchange rate at the end, where you turn in your cash for them, will be a point. And then you'll just lose 2 points for any of those misfortune tiles that you took because you couldn't feed your people or pay your taxes. At the end of that, essentially, whoever has the most points is the winner of Yinzi. Alright, so that is Yinzi, and this is certainly heavier fare than I usually will cover on this channel, but I saw that this game didn't have any coverage yet of it, so I knew that a lot of people would be considering whether or not they want to buy this. It was a relatively expensive game, and I wanted to put out some information about a game that, like I said, hadn't gotten a lot of coverage yet. So just in the, I'm sure somebody will put together a more comprehensive rules video, and more power to them. I just thought that it would be worthwhile to give a brief overview of how the game works, give you a sense of whether or not you might want to purchase the game. I will say that the game is relatively tough to teach. There's a lot going on. It's certainly at least on the level of, one of the Vital Lacerda games in terms of complexity and in terms of rules overhead. Of course, once you learn what your 10 possible actions that you have to explain, all of them very distinct from each other, what those all are, the game does become a lot more manageable in terms of rules overhead, but still extremely difficult your first play to manage your actions because of the unique mechanism in it where you're going to have to play a card as your first action, which will generate workers, which will then enable you to do the worker actions. Bouncing off between those two types of actions and requires you to really plan out your whole turn from the get-go. As soon as you get your 3 cards, you really have to think about, well, if I need workers to do this action that I really want to do, and I need money to do that action, how am I going to make that happen? So you almost have to start with an angle and then work backwards, which is hard for your first play. I've only played this game now twice. It's only gotten to me a few days ago. But I will say that the second play for me, but not with the new people that I was playing with, definitely went smoother. And I think that that will be a common thing. I think once you've played this once you've seen how it goes, it becomes a lot more manageable. The game does come with these two-sided, rather large player aids, and there is one for every player, which is always nice, and it explains the basic actions, but there are a lot of rules left off of here. What I kind of did is I went through the rule book and I made a teaching script after my first playthrough of the game, just so I wouldn't miss anything, because there's a lot of niggling little things. I wouldn't say the game is especially like inelegant or bad with its iconography compared to some heavy games that are out there, but there are a lot of things that aren't on this cheat sheet, so if players are just going to focus on this, they're going to miss a lot and be disappointed when some rule pops up that they weren't paying attention to. So you really do require, I would say, maybe a 30 to 40 minute teach the first time you're going to be playing the game, and that's just the nature of the beast. But I think that it justifies that. It's a very rewarding game. I tend not to gravitate towards heavy games, but this is one that I could see myself playing, several times to see how all these mechanisms work. I feel like there's a lot of room to make inefficient actions, and trying to make all of these interconnected mechanisms in the game sing together is really a nice puzzle that I'm looking forward to exploring more. I think overall the game, for as much information as it's conveying, does present itself rather cleanly. There's a few things that were a little bit confusing the first time I played, but now I feel like everything's really legible, which is important in a game that's asking you to pay attention to this much stuff. And now in my second play, and again, I hate doing a review with just 2 plays, but just in the interest of time, I wanted to put something out. On my second play, I was a lot more immersed in that puzzle, the order of operations between my worker actions and my card actions, and the restriction that you could only do each action once during a given turn really makes your 24 actions over the course of the game exceptionally tight. You can only do each action up to 4 times over the course of the entire game, which includes things like shipping or going to fight in the battles, which are 2 of the main sources of victory points. So just trying to set yourself up to make those actions when you can take them fully efficient, using 3 or even 4 workers to execute those actions becomes really crucial, I think, to maximizing your score in this. So overall, I think that this is a strong game worthy of investigation. It's exceptionally heavy. I would not pretend that it's any lighter than it actually is. Like I said, expect certainly a 30-minute teach your first time you're going to play it, but expect it by maybe the midway through the game to really start to come together, and you'll start seeing how poorly you've played maybe your first turn. And there's a certain reward in that, I suppose. So usually a game that you have to kind of play once to Grok does not, strike me as a great design, but this is one that I think might be worth getting over that initial hurdle. It seems like it's interesting enough to continue investigating. So those are my preliminary thoughts on Yinzi, and thank you for watching.